are the ways we can stop climate change. Let's begin! Let's see. Number one. Number one? No. Bad news. You can't stop climate change. Can't be done! I want you to carve this in stone! Climate change is not avoidable! Also, even if I try to tell you about climate change, it wouldn't help because you don't care about climate change. In fact, this is how this video is going to be titled now. Why don't you care? Here's an interesting study. It says that our ability to worry about something is like a cup. A cup that we can fill with a certain amount of fear. And by using terrible images so much, we have overflowed the cup. And we're overwhelmed. The result? Fear doesn't work. Wait a minute. Are you staying? Okay, let's clarify what climate change is. Greenhouse gases, mainly CO2, that is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. They help the Earth's atmosphere retain the heat of the sun, the so-called greenhouse effect, which is good for many things. Basically, for life to exist. Without these gases, the average temperature of the Earth would be minus 18 Celsius. They are good. But it turns out that one specific species has produced them in large quantities, mainly carbon dioxide. After the so-called Industrial Revolution, we started burning coal, oil, and gas like crazy to produce energy and manufacture things, producing a lot of CO2. In turn, many of the manufactured products also emit CO2. Because of this, the temperature has started to rise more than what would be natural. This is what they call global warming. This warming is the cause of climate change. And our climate getting warmer causes terrible things. Rise of the sea level, overflow of rivers and lakes, forest fires, desertification, death and displacement of species.
That's a lie!
This is often called climate change denial. It's another reason why you don't care about climate change.
What are you saying?
Climate change denial is a stance that basically says that everything about climate...
That's a lie! There's no reliable data.
But there is, actually. Among the most impressive data is the study of Antarctic ice. In that ice, there are air bubbles up to 400,000 years old. In those bubbles, there is data on carbon dioxide levels and temperature of past ages. And we have observed two things. One, that every time CO2 rises, the temperature rises too. And two, that we're currently reaching the highest levels of CO2 ever recorded.
But just look at your own data. Temperatures get warmer and cooler naturally. They follow cycles.
Yeah, that is correct. For millions of years, CO2 levels and temperatures have gone up and down naturally. But natural is not always something cool. Speed is the key. If CO2 levels rise fast, and the planet heats up too fast, it could be a massacre. This is when the so-called Great Dying happened. 95% of species disappeared. For millions of years, the Earth was almost empty. I said the CO2 levels raised fast, but it took thousands of years. Now we could be going back to those levels, but within only a few hundred years.
Even if we are getting warmer, scientists don't agree whether humans are the cause.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is very careful. That's why, when deciding if we're the cause, in 1995 they said that it was possible. After that, likely, and then very likely. The last time they said it was extremely likely. The current rise in CO2 occurs simultaneously with the start of our Industrial Revolution. It is happening, and we are the cause.
People who talk about climate change just want to make money.
The truth, we could say that there's money behind the climate change denial, Because for years, denial studies have been financed by businesses. You can easily find who they are on Google. And the studies that support what we say are not paid by corporations. This group of United Nations scientists has been chosen by 195 countries. Let's call it a tie, for now. I have to admit that there are interests on both sides, and this benefits climate change denial. Because scientific studies we could use against it suddenly don't have as much value. You don't trust them anymore. What if they're just trying to take you for a ride? This is part of what is now labeled post-truth and makes things even more complicated. It seems that even if something is true, you're entitled to not agree with it. And fighting against the post-truth is so exhausting that even if you're not a denier, you'll be looking for excuses so you don't have to fight against it. One of them is techno-optimism. 200 years ago, British scholar Malthus said that at some point, Earth's population would outgrow our ability to produce food. That we would all die of hunger, you know? But Malthus didn't count on technologies such as fertilizers, pesticides, and more resistant seeds that would appear 150 years later, rocketing food production. So it doesn't matter if the planet is getting warmer than usual, as we are not counting on technologies that we'll have in 20 or 30 years that may solve this. Another way to avoid fighting the post-truth is the keep calm, let's chill out attitude. Climate change is real, but we can't all of a sudden start producing our energy with zero CO2. These technologies are expensive, they have to be developed. First we should bet on natural gas, for example. Hey, it produces 50% less CO2 than oil or coal. So yeah, one step at a time. One last tip on how to avoid fighting with the deniers. This is a good one. Go for something safe, saying, we've got other and more urgent problems than climate change. There you go. These are the reasons why you don't care about climate change. But while we're at it, let's try to defuse this mind bomb, right? The World Economic Forum has been publishing a report since 2008 on the risks that threaten humanity. And the top positions are no longer pandemics, wars, or recession. These are now taken over by weapons of mass destruction, such as classic, extreme weather events, water crisis, natural disasters, and, surprise, failure of measures against climate change. Don't get me wrong. It's not that the other risks don't exist, but in terms of global impact, these can do much more damage. And why do they believe that? Did they make it up? No, man. I think it's sheer logic. The reason is that everything is connected. Let me explain. In the last edition, they are visualizing all those threats as a network of problems that are connected to each other. Okay, slowly. It's obvious that if we have a water shortage problem, we're going to have a crop crisis that ends up in a food shortage, right? Climate change is one of the problems most connected to other problems. The water and food crises are the obvious ones, because the rain patterns will change. As the planet warms up, the rains will move to other places, causing droughts in some areas. And the rains will be more aggressive. Also, natural disasters will be increasingly stronger and frequent. Let's add those two. Our cities, roads, tunnels, bridges or dams are not prepared for climate change, and they're expected to fail more and more. In fact, there are already countries asking for help because they believe they will disappear. I'm not talking about environmental groups. I'm talking about governments failing and asking for help. Water shortage, food shortage, climate change will be behind the largest migrations that we will see in the future. And that's another kind of crisis that many governments handle poorly. The full risk map is quite scary. And it is meant for a world of 7.5 billion people. But in 2050, we may be 10 billion. Think of the scale this may have. Everything is connected, and climate change would make worse almost everything you can think of. Does it still make sense to think that we've got more urgent problems if we can pin almost everything on climate change? Don't answer that yet. It is still not a conclusion. What should we go for now? Techno-optimism. The most ambitious thing we have so far is the Paris Agreement, signed by the 195 countries that committed to begin reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially from 2020. to prevent temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius above the levels before the Industrial Revolution. We have already raised it by 1.1 Celsius. We are almost there, and thus relieving the effects. Not avoid them. They are looking to reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. What techno-optimism? No one is planning to avoid climate change. Not avoidable! They're just looking for a way to make it less bad. On the other hand, I'm sorry for being critical of the Paris Agreement, but UN experts said that the decrease of CO2 to which the countries committed to when they signed the agreement would not be enough to stay below those 2 Celsius, but rather would make us reach 3.4 Celsius within this century. Have you been watching the news lately? The most aggressive hurricanes are formed precisely when the surface temperature of the ocean increases. Hurricanes like Irma are breaking records of duration and power. So imagine their intensity if we reach 3.4 Celsius. If countries don't commit themselves more, this grand agreement won't help. Enough with keep calm. This is already happening and we have less time than we think. Countries disappearing, increasingly aggressive natural disasters, lost harvests, hunger, wars over water control, people forced to migrate, governments not prepared for the future which may not respond as we expect. Does this remind you of something? Of course it reminds you of something. People such as writer Ursula K. Le Guin call attention to the fact that, in recent years, movies, literature, and video games only portray this sort of vision about the future. Worlds that are dark and, what's worse, not avoidable. These terrible prophecies are called dystopias. We live in a culture that seems to accept that the future will necessarily be hell. This reinforces our problem. Fear doesn't work to warn about climate change, remember? We're going to try and look at it another way. Question: if everything is connected and climate change worsens other things that we consider urgent problems, will fighting climate change help solve the great problems of humanity? Could we create a positive vision of all this? But we're in the post-truth era and we don't know what the heck to believe, right? However, about this post-truth thing, I decided to leave a little something for the end.
Wow.
Remember what we said earlier. Both groups are trying to fool you, so their interests are balanced out. Deniers and climate change believers. Fight. Well, the truth is that it's not exactly like that. The state subsidies usually go to those energy sources that produce the most CO2. And in most cases, there's no penalty for producing CO2. Let's not argue about this. You just have to Google what I said. Although science is on our side, those who deny that we have a problem have the law on their side. Of course there are economic interests, and there will be as long as there are companies doing business. They work with money. We weren't born yesterday. But the game is rigged. There is no such balance. Here, I can give you a conclusion already. We must ask our governments to guarantee fair play. Remember one of the reasons to keep calm? Well, we can't all of a sudden start producing our energy with zero CO2. These technologies are expensive. They have to be developed. Well, climate change deniers don't want you to know that solar energy is now cheaper than coal, oil, or gas. Nor that a country like Spain is already able to provide electricity for 3 in every 4 houses, with wind power only. It's working. Nor that China, the main producer of carbon dioxide, is starting to catch up and already has 40% of all the wind turbines in the world. So, the post-truth has only one name: manipulation. And the good thing about manipulation is that it doesn't work that well if you know you're being manipulated. Now you can believe in science without getting nervous. Climate change is happening. Since we started recording temperatures, the trend is clear. It's getting warmer. That's not going to change. We have to adapt to the new situation. It is already bad. Let's not make it worse. The sooner we reduce greenhouse gases like CO2, the more we will reduce its effects. We will mitigate them, to use the word that scientists use. I know, talking about adapting to problems and reducing damage is not the sexiest thing in the world, but as I told you, we'll try and look at it in another way. Currently, our power grid is based on fossil fuels. Some countries have them and others don't. And this creates wars over their control and price crisis. But not only that. As these energy sources produce too much CO2, they make climate change worse and intensify this dystopia. But if we're going to adapt to climate changes, we'll have to switch them for renewable energies. What would happen? Less CO2, cheaper energy, and we would reduce the risk of wars. Because energy stops being dependent on one key territory and can be produced almost anywhere. This makes us stronger against crisis, because even if one point in the grid fails, the rest will continue to work, unlike before. That's why some experts say that solar energy has a lot of potential in Africa, where there are no large power grids, and maybe it would be better to produce energy locally. Also, Africa has 7 of the 10 sunniest countries in the world. Maybe soon, Africa will be selling electricity to Europe at a very competitive price. Okay, we would have fewer wars, cheaper energy, and new opportunities for many countries. But this doesn't end here. What if we adapt everything we build to climate change? Well, if we had cities, roads, or bridges better prepared for those future disasters, we could withstand better the disasters we already have. Even deniers will agree that we are not prepared for the hurricanes that hit us today. And if we know that the rainfall patterns are going to change, we should invest in water treatment plants, efficient irrigation, desalination plants, and if we did, we could also better resist other problems that nobody's arguing about, such as water shortages, food crisis. Climate change is a problem that we already have, and since everything is related, fighting it helps to solve almost any other problem we have now. For example, absorbing CO2. Trees are great at absorbing CO2. They love CO2. They are CO2 junkies. What's another thing they're great at? Stopping desertification. A problem that affects 40% of our planet and, if we fight it, would make us stronger against water and food crisis. If we adapt to climate change and mitigate its effects, we would transform society, making it more resistant to any crisis and attacking many other problems that may seem even more urgent. This vision also includes climate change, but it is no longer a dystopia. It doesn't rely on fear. You know what's the opposite of a dystopia, right? A utopia. When in 1965 Stanley Kubrick filmed 2001: A Space Odyssey, man had not yet set foot on the moon. Kubrick hired designers from NASA and told them, there are no limits in cinema. Imagine everything you want to achieve. The movie premiered, and people who worked on the Apollo project have recognized that 2001 changed their way of thinking. Both the designers and engineers who took us to the moon and those who work today to take us further have been deeply influenced by that film. Utopia shaped reality. Climate change is one of the biggest mistakes we have made. But talking about it through fear or dystopia only makes us not want to confront it. There are entries. And some people are taking advantage of this. Utopias don't have to deny the problems. Remember? I told you it was carved in stone. Utopias precisely include the problems because that's the roadmap they want to follow. Even if we don't like it, we will have to adapt to climate change. We will have to fight so that it doesn't go further. What if we stop using fear and start becoming excited about everything we can achieve?